Kill, die, learn, repeat. These 4 words define the experience of Dead Cells. As the creators themselves describe it, Dead Cells is a roguelite, Castlevania-inspired action platformer set inside a sprawling, ever-changing castle, filled with a vast array of enemies. The main mode of progression is 2D Souls-like combat, emphasizing finding speed and a rhythm. As a roguelite game, there's one very apparent truth. You will die. Over and over and over and over again, losing your progress. Thankfully, of course, you get the chance to start over and over and over and over again, but each time with more experience. On the surface, this game is very captivating and addicting. The exhilaration of defeating enemies, speeding through visually stunning biomes, and unlocking abilities and weapons draws you into the gameplay and encourages you to continue to explore. However, looking closely, this dynamic offers us an interesting reflection on our own understanding of history. This connection between Dead Cells and the process of discovering and creating history came to me after attending a WBEZ Chicago discussion with Dr. Eve L. Ewing, who herself is an alum of the University of Chicago, a sociologist of education, and an author of several projects, one of which was 1919, a book of poems inspired by the race riots of the same year and the focus of the event. Throughout this book, Dr. Ewing intended to highlight and share the events of the summer of 1919 in Chicago and the impact that they have today. Before diving into this interesting connection though, let's take a moment to situate ourselves. There is a light spoiler about one of the bosses in the game, so if you care about that and want to discover that plot point for yourself, skip past that point in the video or come back to watch this video later. With that out of the way, let's get started. Dead Cells is set in a dilapidated kingdom on an island, where a terrible disease called the malaise has ravaged it, even being the cause of the various monsters that lurk in the prisoners' quarters where you begin each run, and all throughout the kingdom through different biomes like the Promenade of the Condemned and the Toxic Sewers. As you move through the kingdom, you come across different objects, areas, and characters that reveal more about the history of the effects of the malaise on the kingdom and the efforts taken to eradicate the virus. The better you get and the more skills you acquire, the farther you'll go. Seems pretty linear, right? The idea of time and history moving in a linear fashion is very commonplace. People tend to move from one thing to the next, whether they're looking forward or behind them as they do it. As much as this may be the case, there's also a somewhat cyclical nature to life. During the WBEZ event, Dr. Ewing spoke on this idea, especially in relation to our understanding of race relations throughout history in the US, saying, "Our racial narrative in the United States is a comfortable one of linear progress. We often have a misconception that time and history is strictly something that moves in a linear fashion, but it's also very cyclical in nature, whether it's the fact that there are 24 hours in each day, or the fact that we tend to engage in some of the same activities and routines each day." Dead Cells is a prime example of this idea. As a roguelike game by nature, there's an inevitable cycle of dying and beginning again that occurs as you play. The rooms in each biome are procedurally generated in order to create a sense of difficulty, while at the same time not abandoning the familiarity of each space, allowing you to learn from each run. The timer for each run also doesn't start until you begin to move through the biome in which you are traversing. Dr. Ewing also mentioned the importance of the cyclicity of life by stressing the idea that seeing time and history in such a way allows people to be more attentive to the patterns and recurrences of life, and to identify both the beneficial and harmful elements so as to maximize the positive and minimize the negative, saying, "We look around the city and we see these things as though they just happened, right? Like the segregation fairy came with her wand and just made it this way. And it didn't happen like that. There's people, policies, institutions, and histories that led us to this moment. And so I think it's often uncomfortable when those moments don't have a very tidy solution." French sociologist Michel Maffesoli espouses the same view of life cyclicity in his essay, The Return of the Tragic in Postmodern Societies. He makes mention of circumambulation from one of Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung's theories, saying that it describes the slow circular work that everyone must undergo, a process of continually learning about oneself and becoming better to fulfill themselves in a surplus being that reveals them to themselves. The same principle of circumambulation applies to dead cells, as there are several mechanics that emphasize the importance of learning to recognize what will allow you to progress further in the game. The variability in weapon and blueprint drops, mutations you can choose after clearing each biome, skill upgrades you can obtain and pick from, permanent upgrades through certain runes, as well as unlockable perks or weapons you can get using cells you pick up from defeated enemies, are all elements that the game encourages you to explore and experiment with in order to improve after each run. Embracing the procedural cycle of dying, beginning anew, and continually improving is essential to advancing throughout the game. The path to progress may not be clear, but it reveals itself with time. As Maffesoli remarks, from such a viewpoint, the world and the individual do not progressively become what they ought to be in the light of a predetermined telos, but rather, one might say, they arrive at what they are. With all these different dynamics, it can be very easy to think that history is supposed to be something that can only be impacted by large-scale events or prominent people. However, history is more than that. History is something that we create each day on a personal level. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the word history is also defined as something that has been done or experienced by a particular person or thing repeatedly over a long period. One of the most poignant insights Dr. Ewing shared during the discussion event was that many Black individuals who had lost their lives due to racial violence and injustice were robbed of their ability to create their own personal everyday history. The focus of one of her poems in 1919 was Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Black Chicagoan himself, who was lynched in Mississippi while visiting family. Her poem, I Saw Emmett Till This Week at the Grocery Store, imagines Till still being alive as an old man, living out his life in an ordinary, peaceful way. Dr. Ewing also spoke of how we stand in the midst of history at the discussion, recalling the city's preparations for maintaining order in the face of the verdict of the Jason Van Dyke trial being released, which was the subject of another poem in 1919 called It Wouldn't Take Much. As Dr. Ewing recalled, I remember passing through downtown that day and seeing big empty CTA buses with police in them because they were literally ready to use the buses to engage in mass arrest if needed. That's wild. Sometimes we are very acutely aware of living through history. We have a certain notion of what constitutes a historic moment that I think is often quite narrow. Historic moments exist everywhere, large and small. As Maffesoli states, the tragic sense of life, whether acknowledged or not, whether conscious or unconscious, reminds us that the grayness of the everyday cannot exist without moments of rupture that periodically illuminate it. Even while playing Dead Cells, you as both the protagonist and the player create your own history. At the beginning of each run, a multitude of glass cases showcase the various items and weapons you've collected along the way, and the scribe is straight ahead, recording your progress. All the while, your ability to go on these runs is also connected to the impact the malaise has had on the kingdom, and the efforts that certain characters are taking to combat it, namely the Timekeeper, who we discover has been looping time to combat the malaise, motivated by her sadness at the ruin and tragedy it has brought to the kingdom. And perhaps that's the most important thing about Dead Cells' demonstration of history, the acknowledgement of tragedy. There's an old saying that goes, the first step in solving a problem is acknowledging there is one. Tragedy is written all over the environment of the game. The piles of bodies, grotesque monsters, corpses, and damaged structures all scream catastrophe. Everything is broken, but accepting the brokenness is part of the process. In his commentary on Maffesoli's essay, literary theorist Terry Eagleton explains this. Tragedy is not always about despair. It can also be, to adopt Yeats's splendid lines, a matter of recognizing that nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. The fact that it may be made whole does not diminish the tragedy of the rending, of the fact that only by a passage through hell is redemption conceivable. The main reason you embark on your journey as the beheaded is that you've acknowledged that the malaise has torn the kingdom apart, and that the only way for any sort of change to occur is for you to keep trying to traverse through each biome in hopes of finding a solution. You're going on your own passage through the hell that is this malaise-ridden kingdom to find some sort of redemption, and the kind of redemption you find is up to you. Perhaps this dynamic of tragedy that Dead Cells explores is meant to reflect our own lives in the 21st century. In these last few years, we've experienced our own pandemic with COVID-19, our own malaise, so to speak, and we've witnessed the legacy of systems of inequality at work in marginalized communities. We're passing through our own hell of sorts, if you will. However, the tragedies we live through aren't just moments of despondency. They remind us that the only way we can even begin to imagine a better future for ourselves is for us to embrace this difficult cyclicity, to traverse the hellish dungeons of inequality, hatred, and greed to find redemption. All in all, Dead Cells is a very impactful microcosm of what circumambulation looks like. It presents to us the notion that history and time don't just have to be something that travel from point A to point B. They aren't just something that pass us by. We're actively in relationship with them, especially because history is something we constantly create, whether on a grand scale or the very individual, ordinary level. Living life day in and day out through some of the same challenges repeating themselves over and over again can be disheartening, but accepting the ways in which brokenness is present in our world and choosing to traverse through it is the only way we can create positive progress. As Dr. Ewing emphatically put it during the WBEZ event, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I agree, but we need to bend it. In this same sentiment, Dead Cells underscores the perspective that progress can't be made without acknowledging that things are damaged, torn apart, or broken, or having to do the breaking yourself. Whether that means starting difficult conversations about the legacy of Chicago's Red Summer, like Dr. Ewing did with her book 1919, or simply picking up a controller and diving back into another run of Dead Cells. Engaging with history is a chance to embrace the cyclicity of tragedy and turn it into triumph.